This talk was, the title I gave it originally was Basic Steps in Managing and Creating a Structured Vocabulary. The ISKO people have decided to feature it as great steps, and I don't know whether I can actually live up to that, but I'll do my best. Basically, I'm going to talk about what's necessary to create manage a vocabulary project. And I was basing some of what I'm saying on the international standard for information and documentation, thesaurus, and interoperability with other vocabularies. This standard 25964 was created by a working party led by Stella Dexter Clark. And I was on that working party, and so were several other members of ISKO. So although I'll base my talk on there, I will put in some other thoughts of my own, which may not necessarily match it. I do recommend, though, that the project should actually refer to this standard. The trouble is, because it is sold by the British Standards Institution, and it costs £361 for about 160 pages, even for a PDF version. So for individual people, this might be a little bit prohibitive, which is regrettable. I'm sorry, but I can't do anything about that. The steps that we're talking about, I divided up into 7 steps in the project of creating a structured vocabulary, and we'll just go through those in turn. First of all, why, who, and what. If you've got a job of creating a structured vocabulary, then the first thing is, why are you doing this at all? What's the purpose of it? What's it needed for? Is there an existing system which needs to be improved, or is there an existing system which doesn't have any structured access at all? How long is it going to last? What are the future plans for it? Is it going to be a one-off thing, or is it going to be something which is going to live with the institution for many years into the future? And are there arrangements for supporting it in the long term? Far too often, we find that projects get a lot of money to develop something at once, and they have great enthusiasm for a year or two, and then things peter out because they're not maintained in the long term. And you have to make sure that this is going to be the case if it's going to be worthwhile doing. The other questions about deciding how you do it will be asking, for example, what is it going to be used to index? If it's going to be used to create metadata on certain objects, then you can have different kinds of things. Some things have got words in them themselves, and words, as we've seen in previous talks in this series, can be used by computers to retrieve information without human intervention, without metadata or cataloging or indexing terms being applied. Textual documents and forms apply to those, but with images and products or objects, then you may have to supply descriptions of what they are and they can be found. And one question at the end then is, if you've got existing text, can you actually rely upon automatic access to that text? Or do you need to add index terms as metadata from a structured vocabulary? It may be that you can have a structured vocabulary or a search thesaurus, as they're called, to suggest and assist the automatic indexing by expanding synonyms, expanding alternative terms, broadening and narrowing searches, and generally interacting with the searcher. Another constraint is what software it will use. I'm not going to discuss particular software products, but in assessing what you can do, you need to know how it's going to be managed, what your system is capable of. Are you going to be developing a thesaurus, a vocabulary system, and a standalone package, which can then be imported to a database system? Does the database system itself contain the facilities for managing a vocabulary? Or are you going to be using shared or linked data where you're linked to a vocabulary database which is held elsewhere? Even within an organization, is it going to be centralized on a network server or distributed so that people have versions of it on their own systems? And in that case, how do you keep those in step with one another? The features and constraints of the system are going to determine what it's possible to do. If it can't handle certain constructs, then there's no point in creating them. And the question is then, when the people are searching, are they going to be searching it as a black box where they just put some terms in and expect to get an answer coming out, like Google does effectively? Or are they going to, is the system going to provide some form of interactivity? Is it actually going to take the place of an intermediary in a reference interview by suggesting to people that the term they put in may or may not retrieve some things, but there are alternative terms which they might like to add to their question. They may want to broaden or narrow their question, and the system can help with this. Unfortunately, many systems don't provide that form of interactivity, but it's nice if it's there. Then there's the question, who's going to use it? Is it for subject specialists, both within your organization or externally? Or is it going to be information specialists who are going to be searching? These will determine the vocabulary that is used, whether you're doing technical vocabularies or public or lay person's vocabularies. And there's the question, who's going to create and maintain it? As I say, we have to be sure that something is going to be maintained into the future. And is it going to be done by specialists or by users? And are there going to be provisions for feedback so that if the users have difficulty and they need to, if you want to know how well the system is working, how it needs to be modified to cope with change, then is there arrangement for suggestions and query logs, or checking on how things are changing, how things are working? This is perhaps the core of what I was going to talk about, the different kinds of relationship, kinds of vocabulary. And I have a bit of a bug about the word taxonomy because I don't like it, because nobody knows what it means. Taxonomy nowadays seems to be used as a generic term for any kind of structured vocabulary or knowledge organization system. And sometimes it just means it's a thesaurus which doesn't obey the rules, and it's a bit of a sloppy thesaurus. We call it the taxonomy because it sounds better. I think that we should keep the word taxonomy for its original structure, which is in the biological sense, where we have a single generic relationship only, monohierarchical, one item, like the green box in this top screen, can only be one place. And we have hierarchy, we've got genus species hierarchical relationships to its parents, so that at any point we have an item here, which could be, say we've got primates, then we may have humans, monkeys, archbishops, and so on, as the narrower terms of that, but they are all aspects of primates. So each concept is there at the place of unique definition. There's a single hierarchy, and it can be as deep or as shallow as you like, but that's the kind of taxonomy we have in biology, and I think it's best if we can keep the name to that. To go further than that, in a thesaurus, we can create several of those hierarchical structures because they relate to different aspects, different facets of the subject. And we'll look at those in a minute. But in two things about that. One is that a term can occur in more than one place. So that if we have objects here, or musical instruments, say, you can have a musical instrument, which is a piano, might come under the broader term of keyboard instruments. It may also come under the broader term of stringed instruments, because a piano is indeed both a keyboard instrument and a stringed instrument. If these are objects, we have another hierarchy of activities, and you can't have a hierarchical relationship between an activity and an object, but you can have a link for just labeled as related terms, saying that there is a relationship between those two, but not a hierarchical relationship. In a thesaurus, we don't actually specify the nature of that related relationship beyond saying it is related. If we go further than that to an ontology, then we can specify the nature of the relationships in much more detail. The little blue diamonds I put here are relationship labels, which can say that one is a cause, an effect, or a product, and the raw materials from which the product is made, or a place, and so on. So you can have any kind of relationship built in a whole network there, which gives you an ontology structure. So those are the three main types that I would see as appropriate for a structured vocabulary: a taxonomy, a thesaurus, or an ontology. There are two other kinds, which we'll talk about a little bit further. And a classification scheme, for example, is mainly required where you need to have compounds rather than just a single term in a hierarchy. You may want to combine two concepts together, and we'll look at that in a little while. An authority file is similar, but normally relates to proper names of people, of organizations, and places. And the relationships in an authority file are of a different kind. They may be that two companies have merged to form a third one, or people may be married to somebody else, or may have somebody as a child, or maybe other relationships that occur between people and organizations, and so on. So an authority file has different kinds of relationships and are usually kept with proper names, and usually they're separate, although they can be combined into a thesaurus. If we go on from there, then, there are many of these schemes already, and one question before you start actually developing one is to look and see whether somebody has already done the work. There is a register of thesauri, ontologies, and classifications at Bartok, which lists 3,400 vocabularies and many other registries and services, some of which you can download, some of which give you online access, some of which you've got to pay for. But it's worth having a look there and seeing whether someone else has done it, both because it will save you time and because using another vocabulary, which is common to more than one place, gives you great opportunities of sharing data and sharing work. That may not be appropriate if it's internal and if confidential and commercial material that you're handling, but for public information or information which is going to be able to be shared, then it's certainly worth looking to see whether it's possible to do that. Even if you don't take existing vocabulary as it stands, but you can still use it as a source of concepts, a source of terms, which you can combine into your own structure. So once we've said that we've decided what we're going to do, The first stage in doing it is to collect concepts, the concepts being units of thought, which you are going to organize material by. And if you don't adopt an existing scheme, these terms may come from personal or departmental schemes or indexes. People may have lots of little databases in access on their own computers and so on, which if you're going to try to get something institutional wide, you may well want to try to persuade people to merge these. And indeed, if you're going to put something then using terms that people are already familiar with and know what they mean, know, like, and use them, then it's worth doing that. You can look at previous queries if you've got a working database already. And if you certainly need to clarify the definition and meanings of terms, then reference works, glossaries, dictionaries, textbooks, and catalogues, and so will provide useful reference material. The concept is not necessarily, the specificity is not so important in some cases. You need to decide an appropriate specificity. And looking at an old cartoon from Punch, which I haven't been able to reproduce for copyright reasons, but the caption of it said that railway ticket clerk with a limited number of categories for accompanying animals said to an old lady traveling with a menagerie of pets, cats are dogs and rabbits are dogs, and so are parrots. But this here tortoise is an insect, and there's no charge for that. So they've got categories for dogs and insects, and that's all. That may be enough for those purposes, and you can choose when you're creating vocabulary how specific you need to be, what distinctions you need to make, what is appropriate. You check when choosing which concepts are worth including, whether there's duplication or overlap, or what they actually mean. If you have ships and boats, what's the difference? If you have a galley within a ship, you may want to include cooking vessels in that, and is that to be distinguished from the vessels which they are watercraft? So defining the concepts, distinguishing them, and writing scope notes, everybody knows what they mean. And it may well be that the terms that you use within a controlled vocabulary have a narrower scope, a narrower meaning than those terms in common parlance. Everybody knows what a ship is, perhaps, but within your scope, you will have a strict definition so that you can say that certain items will be indexed as ships, others will be indexed as boats. Apparently, submarines are always called boats rather than ships, but I wasn't aware of that. When you have distinguished the concept which you're going to use for indexing, you need to know which terms you're going to use to label them, which are going to be the preferred terms, and which are going to be non-preferred, so that people will find it even though they don't use your preferred term. In English vocabulary, you might well want to use lakes instead of lochs, whereas in Scotland we might want to put it the other way around. You may want to say that some things are not worth distinguishing, that you may want to use money instead of cash, although these are not exactly the same in their scope and concept, but for your purposes, it may be not useful to use both of those, but to merge them together and use one of those terms. And you can decide whether you're going to split terms and create concepts, compounds, such as coal mining. Do you actually enter coal mining as a term, it's a broader term, mining, narrower terms, coal mining, iron ore mining, graphite mining, and so on? Or do you split it and use the materials plus mining? In other words, apply both of those terms to a document so they can be searched in combination or separately. Having collected the concepts, we then have to structure them together. And we do this by said earlier, by sorting them into facets, which are hierarchical in nature. The fundamental categories which form facets are not absolutely objective, but they should be consistent. And we need to keep this hierarchical is-a relationship within each facet. An example here is of persons. You may want to subdivide them by various criteria into arrays. We have persons, first of all, subdivided by age, for example, and this label in angle brackets is what we call a node label, showing the characteristic of division. It's a node label showing that we're dividing these by age. We could have another node label of persons by occupation, and so on. The persons at the top is the label is the name of the facet. And you can do this kind of structure both from a top-down or a bottom-up approach. In fact, in practice, you generally do both. You both do a little bit of one, sort them into what appears to be sensible groupings, and then look and see what would fall within that, and decide whether, if your preconceived ideas of what the useful facets would be, actually matches the material you've got. Typical facets which you might create are things like things, activities, abstract concepts, places, times, materials, properties, people and organizations. And this is not the proper names of people and organizations, but categories of people, and events being things which have got a time and a place. When we've got these things grouped in this way, we can create more relationships. Sorry, we'll go back. Went on one too far. This is another example of facets of that kind. An activities facet with its facet label and its node label showing characteristics of division. And these can be created at various levels, so you can go down as far as you need to. It always irritates me a little bit when people talk about having a hierarchical structure and saying how many levels should it have, because I don't think the number of levels is relevant at all. It depends how much you need to subdivide. You can subdivide as much or as little as you like, depending on the material and the specificity that you require. Once you've created the hierarchical structures like that of facets, you can then create related terms between them, so that mining would become in an activities facet. Quarrying would also be in an activities facet. Miners would be in a persons facet, and mines would be in a place or objects facet. And similarly, cabbages could be given the related terms of butterflies or products from cabbages. In an ontology, then in more specific relationships, as I said earlier, rather than just RT, related term, you can have source of, component of, made in, and so on. Then you've got a structure, you've got of each facet in a hierarchy, and you've got links between them. Then you may need to combine things. In people searching would generally want to combine more than one term, and this can be done in two ways. We have the post-coordinating searching, which is post means after the database is created, after the indexing is done. And this can be done by allowing people to combine several terms in a search statement. So they might want to put in a Google box, for example, put in cabbages cooking, just two terms, and expect the system to look for documents, look for resources which combine those terms. Or you can make it explicit and say that you want to do a Boolean statement, cabbages and cooking, not pickles, for example. This allows you, allows flexibility, but it doesn't give you any kind of linear order. It allows you, when you're searching in this way, you can do it this way, both on the search term and the initial search, or you can provide filters so that after you have an initial search, you can then do further combinations. I was searching for a new case for my mobile phone. I've just blurred this out again to avoid anybody objecting from eBay's copyright. But you see that they provided, after I'd searched for mobile phone cases, it then gave me the option of combining additional facets, one for design and finish and choosing terms from that, or material and choosing terms from that. So that this is a way in which you can do post-coordination of concepts from several different facets together. Alternatively, you can have pre-coordination when you combine the facets when you're doing the indexing. And in this case, you can get a useful citation order. You can get a useful sequence of compounds. You have to decide in which order you combine things. You can specify that activities come first and objects come second. So we've got cultivating and various objects that can be cultivated, cooking and various objects can be cooked. Or the other way around, you can take the objects first and say the object and what you do with them. This is in traditional classification, they often take activities in the form of disciplines, so that in traditional library classification, like UDC or Dewey, you have the activity first, the discipline coming first. You've got physics or art or education or something, and then you have within that the things that may be indexed, maybe educated or maybe drawn. So you'd have to decide on the citation order if you're going to have compounds of that kind. And in that case, you can show how compounds would be displayed and combined in a faceted classification. And according to the classification group, there is only one form of classification that is useful, and that is a faceted classification like this. You decide on the citation order. In this case, I've shown that materials can have activities subordinated to it. And obviously you can take some of the blue terms and subordinate them as well. So you can have people who are doing this process at any point in this, you can have a combination. Again, in a display of this kind, you have to be careful to realize where combinations are occurring. And because of that, we've included the facet label where a combination has occurred. I've put in activities here. We're now switching from objects, materials, to activities. And the relationship in a hierarchy of this kind is not a genus species. There is no direct hierarchical relationship between cooking and cabbages. This is a combination that's occurring. Whereas between cabbages and leaf vegetables, it is a hierarchical relationship. So that be careful not to interpret a scheme of this kind as saying this is a hierarchy. This is a combination method. Having got our scheme developed, however it is, whichever of those schemes we choose, however we divide it, we've got to make sure that it actually works. And the next step in the creation is to test and refine it. We have to write an introduction. This goes back to the international standard, which has a section about this, saying that you've got to explain what it is like, what choices you've made, what decisions you've made in trying to structure things. What is its structure? What is its scope? What does it cover? What are the conventions that you've used for symbols and displays? And what the arrangements are to provide feedback and updating. Then you've got to try it out, apply it to sample documents, get people to give you some possible queries and see whether it works. The compiler, the editor, is going to try it out, but also you need to get indexers to make sure that they can find the terms that they need for a sample of documents, and users to do some searching. We're not going to do full-scale retrieval tests for specificity, for precision, and recall, and so on, but at least try it out and see that it appears to give you useful results, and results which are manageable from the purposes of the users that you actually got. Then, if it's not already in the database, you have to load it on and see that it can actually work in the data structure that you're using. Once you've tested it and think it's more or less working, you then have to actually install it and make it available to users. Load a live version in a single network system or distributed. Paper prints are not so likely to be required nowadays because everybody wants to call things up on screens, but traditionally having a volume on your desk where you can thumb through is helpful. And you have to consider whether you're going to keep it within your organization or whether, as I said, there was a clearinghouse with 3,400 different schemes. Do you want to add yours or make it available in some way to people outside the organization? It's always helpful to be prepared to share work that's being done. Finally, having got the scheme in use, we must remember that it's not a one-off. It's got to be maintained. We need to provide for feedback and review. Are people going to be, indexers, for example, going to be able to add new terms on the fly as they find a need for them, or do they have to make an application to the Thesaurus editor to include new terms, suggesting what the new term scope should be, what its relationship should be? Can you actually review the scheme in its practical implementation to see whether or not it is working? Can you review successes and failures? And if you have the number of postings, the number of times a document has been indexed with a particular term, if a term is only used very few times, it possibly is too specific. If it's indexed, if it's used many times, it may be too broad. Although you've got to allow for the fact that two broad terms may be combined together to give you more specificity than the individual terms on their own would do. You need to make some arrangement for recording changes. If you do maintain the scheme, then you have to record both what's changed and when it was changed, because things will previously have been indexed, and the searching will require either that you go back and re-index things retrospectively, or you tell people for documents indexed before 2019, use the following term, after that use the following different term. And if the system is dispersed, then of course you've got the difficulty of maintaining several different versions, and people may have modified them and so on. So that's quite tricky to keep tracks on all of those. Finally, a thesaurus, structured vocabulary, is something that you've got to learn to live with. They say a dog is not just for Christmas, a dog is for life, and a thesaurus is the same. And Ranganathan said a library is a growing organism. So I would say that a thesaurus, or a structured vocabulary, is also a growing organism. And with that, I wish you luck in whatever you create.